Hello folks, Jack here from Peach Guitars, and what you'll have heard in that very loud, very raucous opening little segment there was the theme of today's video. Of course, if you haven't already got it, I want to explore a little bit further the idea that we set about in a Board Talk episode a few weeks ago, talking about some of the tones of Jimi Hendrix. So I want to kind of push on a little bit today and take a deeper dive on that, because it proved to be quite a popular video that we did. And what I did in that video was I really focused on more of the way that he used his pedals in different ways throughout different eras of his career, which of course was very, very short, unfortunately. So he didn't really get a lot of time, I don't think, to explore all the different sonic avenues that he wanted to. And yet he still provided the world with many, many iconic guitar tones and just certain very few effects that he used. Mostly, of course, he was playing his Fender Strat guitars through a Marshall style amp. That's kind of what he's known for, but the contributions that he made tonally to the guitar world were enormous. And a lot of you that watched the last video kind of proved that point, I think, with your comments. There was a lot of very impassioned commentary on that video, which is great. So I thought today it would be a good idea to branch out a little further and just maybe give a few more of my own thoughts on what I think makes his playing so great and his tones so timeless. So, in that intro segment there, I wanted to show the kind of full breadth of what he was known to do, which I think was to span from the most beautiful, clean Fender Strat tones that you could possibly imagine, all the way up to the most raucous, nasty, in-your-face fuzz tones at the same time. And he managed to control those two beasts very, very effectively and made them work together, which is something that really no other guitarist, I think, has achieved quite the same ever since. So, lest I talk too much about Hendrix's influence as a guitar player, I really want to just take a little bit more of a focus today on the tones. And let me preface this video before I delve in by saying that if you would like to find out any more information about any of the products that I'm going to show you in this video, they'll all be linked in the description below, and you can find out the full info at peachguitars.com. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's start with the basics. Of course, he is known as a Fender Strat player, and this guitar that I'm playing is a custom shop replication of basically certain components that his most iconic Strats had on them. So this is kind of referring, of course, to the later era of the Strats that he used. I believe in his earliest days when he first came over to the UK, he was using the Strats of the time, of course, which were the early CBS guitars, 65, 66 kind of era Strats, which had a different tone. And if you want to find out my thoughts a little bit more on that, then check out the previous Board Talk video that we did, where I talked a little bit about the differences between his earlier Strat tones and his later Strat tones. This guitar is kind of towards the tail end of his career, so the famous Woodstock Isabella, I believe it's called, Strat. I think this guitar has a lot of that influence. So the big headstock, the late 60s kind of style Strat. So other than that, it's pretty much, I believe, well, he always just used stock guitars, really. I don't think his guitars ever underwent too many modifications. Nothing too crazy going on with the guitars. You can kind of get pretty close with a Strat. Now, the other point I want to make that I didn't do in the last video is the fact that one of the biggest contributors to his tone was the coily cable, which I'm not using today, well, as you can see once again. I think what I want to stress here in this video is not to kind of replicate any sounds. You know, similarly to what we do throughout the other artist-inspired videos that I've done, I'm never trying to strive to replicate the tones, but I really just want to get in the mindset of what those tones represented for those artists and how they used the gear that they used to kind of to produce the music that they produce. So I'm using a Dr. Z amplifier in place of a Marshall Plexi. I have some degree of sanity, so I'm not going to use a 100-watt Plexi in this room, but I will talk a little bit more about the amp. And the Dr. Z Remedy, which I'm using today, is one of the best Plexi-style amps that I've ever used. It does a very good job of copying some of those Hendrix tones. So the stuff on the floor, I think, is probably the most crucial part of trying to get close to a Hendrix sound. The guitar and the amp are pretty self-explanatory, and you can get close with any Strat and any Marshall. However, it's when you delve into the pedals that's where the discrepancies lie. So I'm using today the Hendrix series Octavia from MXR and Dunlop. I'm using the King Tone Silicon Mini Fuzz, which kind of pertains to Hendrix's later tones. Once again, in his earlier days he was using germanium fuzz. In his later days he moved to the silicon-based unit, so his tone got a little brighter, a little bit more aggressive, as you'll have heard in that intro segment. I'm also using a full-tone Clyde standard wah, which I think is one of the best replications that you can get of Clyde McCoy era wah pedals, which isn't exactly what Hendrix used. He was famous for using Vox wahs and various other bits and pieces. And we don't have currently stock of the Dunlop Jimi Hendrix signature wah pedal, so I'm using the full tone. I think it gets pretty close. And lastly, I've got the King Tone 1968 Vibe, which, no, not much to say about that pedal. If you know what it is, it's probably the best Univibe on the market. So, simple stuff, but it equates to a massive, massive tone. So let me delve in a little further here, and I'm going to play each of the effects in the way that I think Hendrix intended them to be used. I'm just going to talk a little bit about them at the same time. So, let's start with the basic tone, no pedals at all. So this is just the Strat into the Dr. Z amp. Alright, so that sound on its own isn't necessarily the sound that you would most associate with Hendrix. What I think gets a little closer is rolling back the volume. And there are certain tracks that are on his recorded sessions that he just played the guitar into the amp. So Wind Cries Mary, for example, is a great example of that, and I'm going to kind of play around on that theme just by turning the guitar volume down and just letting the amp breathe a little more. Here's what that tone is. So that clean tone is so warm and it's so rich, and yet because of the Marshall style amplifier, it has this really nice punch to it that you don't necessarily get out of a Fender clean. It also starts to saturate in a little bit of a different way, and that's just the magic of Hendrix's clean tone, is that really warm sound that was always on the verge of pushing a little further. So if I now play the bridge pickup and turn the tone down a little bit, here's what you get. It's an amazing tone. It's really dynamic, and that's without even using any pedals yet. And I think the important thing to note here as well is that the amp isn't that distorted. When I lay into the guitar, there's a little bit of gain on tap, but the fact that Hendrix's amps were 100 watt Marshalls. In the earlier days, I think they were the JTM 45 100s, so they were pretty clean amps anyway. Later on, as he went into the super lead Marshall period, his amps did get a little more distorted, and coupled with the change from germanium to silicon fuzz as well also brought about a bit more aggression in the tone. So that's an interesting dynamic there. I'm kind of splitting the difference with this Dr. Z, but being a lower wattage amp, I'm not driving it all the way. I think that's important to point out. I'm not cranking the amp to its maximum. I'm going to let the fuzz do the heavy lifting for the gain. So speaking of that, let's crank the fuzz. So that's what the fuzz does, and there's an important point to make there. You'll have heard there, I backed the volume off too much. I actually turned the volume off and the fuzz made disgusting sounds. The beauty of Hendrix's playing is that he had this really primitive gear, which we still covet today as guitar players. We still love that stuff and the way it works. And yet it just does totally unexpected things like that. When the volume's off on the guitar, the fuzz makes noises like that. The beauty of his playing is how he made that work for him. And as an emerging artist at the time, exploring totally new sounds, the gear and how primitive it was and still is in the designs of these things is one of the biggest contributors to that, I think. If he had perfectly functioning gear, not to say that this stuff doesn't function perfectly, by the way, it's the way it's designed, but if the gear didn't have those little idiosyncrasies and those little interesting things to them, he'd never have played like that. He'd never have made those sounds. The feedback would never have happened. The glorious modulating univibe tones would never have happened. And certainly I think the Octavia tones wouldn't have happened. So let me explore that a little bit. I believe he used the Octavia in conjunction with the fuzz face a lot, but I'm just going to play you the Octavia on its own so you can hear the drastic impact that it has. And once again, this was not a very common effect that he used all the time. You hear it on a couple of signature solo tones, and you hear it a little later on the kind of Band of Gypsies era, at least as far as I know. There's probably more examples than I know, but I'm not really a Hendrix nut. But let me just show you what this sounds like, and you can kind of hear straight away the influence that this pedal had on certain Hendrix licks and riffs. So here we go. Alright, now here's with the fuzz, and this is where the magic comes from. There's that fuzz again. Alright, so Octavia is a big part. Now I have to mention probably the most important thing here, which is the wah. Now I've covered this in the Board Talk episode once again, so if you want more information about the pedals specifically, then check that video out. But here's with the full tone wah. I'm going to play it clean, and then I'm going to put the fuzz on, and you'll hear, once again, it's all a big organic machine. It all works together, and that's the whole point. Here's the wah. It's raucous, it's nasty and it's gross, and that's the magic of it. So that's kind of what the wire does, and I think the fuzz just amplifies everything about the wire. And I've got it placed before the wire as well. I think that's important to point out. The placement is very important and significant in the pedal order. So that's kind of given a little bit of an idea of the Strat tones, and for me, I always think the live stuff just sounds better. I mean, I think the production on the records is questionable. It never really translated the magic and the enormity of that tone and those effects, whereas the live stuff really does. So that's kind of a little bit of an approximation on the Strat stuff. However, I also just want to bring in another guitar that I think is probably, it's not as crucial to his tone, but he was certainly pictured with one quite often. So let's grab another guitar and I'll talk a few of my thoughts on that. Do I need to introduce this guitar? I don't think so. So, famously, Hendrix used a few other guitars alongside his Strats. The most famous of which was probably his psychedelic Flying V, which I think is now in the Hard Rock Cafe, I believe. Now, it's not necessarily fair to say that he had two distinct sounds, but I do think that when he played his Gibson style guitars, there was also a white SG Custom or something I seem to remember. A few other things. It's obviously a different sound. It's a much thicker sound, and so his playing took a bit of a different turn. And if you've ever heard any choice recordings of his where he's playing a Gibson guitar, it's a very different direction. It's a lot more rhythmic in my estimation anyway, and there's certainly an element of just playing the guitar in more of a kind of traditional way, if you like. And that's maybe not necessarily to discredit what his work with these guitars was, to say that it's more traditional, but you know, he had to just work with what he did, what he had. He didn't have some of the technological advancements that the Strats had at the time. So the Gibson tone, obviously a Gibson into a Marshall, is shrouded in gold paper. It's one of those extremely, extremely revered tones anyway, but the fact that Hendrix used it from time to time is like sort of next level, is next tier. So let me just play the guitar into the amp a little bit more and kind of throw out a few Hendrixisms. Also, E flat is the biggest element of his tone that doesn't always get mentioned. The E flat thing is so pivotal to this sound sounding the way that it does and him sounding different to other artists. The elasticity in the strings, just the extra depth that the tuning provides, and certain other quirks make this the Hendrix sound, basically, that a lot of others have copied. So here's a little bit of Gibsonism with the E flat thing. Alright, so there we are folks, a little bit of a deeper dive into the Hendrix stuff. It's not stuff that I often get a chance to talk about. As I say, it's not really my wheelhouse either. I'm not a huge Hendrix nut, unfortunately, but I certainly have a lot of appreciation and a lot of reverence for the innovations that he made to the guitar game. I think we all do, really. It's undeniable. And whether he was playing a Gibson or whether he was playing a Strat, he always sounded like Jimi Hendrix, and that's the most crucial thing. He made the tools work for him. That's ultimately what we all have to do, but it is fun to do a little bit of a case study sometimes and just focus in on the elements that went into the greatest players that we've ever heard and what they used to make them that way. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this closer look at the Hendrix stuff. If you want to find out any more information about any of these products, as I said, then check out the website by clicking the link in the description below. Please do me a favour and comment down below with your thoughts, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel as well, and that you ring the bell so you're notified of all the videos that we put up in the future. That would really help us out a lot. So take care of yourselves, stay tuned, and until next time, keep playing. I don't know how to end this video. Bye-bye.
Thank you.